to me also, if you find this interesting, improvisations never quite go the way we think they will, or should, or hope they will, and I really like that aspect. Like when I was at college, I had a friend who was an amazing classical pianist, and you could never understand how I could improvise, and I could never understand how you could get over a score. You can do that from beginning to end without. If you're doing that, people know you're reading the music. You never understood that skill. But for me, I like the challenge of the improvisation keeps you listening, keeps you focused in the space, hopefully all the time. And sometimes things come in a place where you didn't quite time it, or you didn't quite imagine it, not precisely, but then you have to kind of go with that because the form is open. And that kind of harks back to the days when I was at college, when we, again, I mentioned we had just tape recorders before the kind of first Macintoshes that we had. And to create a sound, you literally have to either cut stuff up, slow it down, or have 3 or 4 tape recorders and mix them all into one sound. And there's something about the physicality and quality of that really lost. And the idea is that actually when you time sounds, for example, the idea of first you start to think, okay, there's a particular sound I like. How do I create it? What are its component parts? And how do they move in a way to kind of come close to the sound that I'm imagining in my head? So that's also a way of kind of training you. Kind of what my teacher called at the time, and it's still an interesting thing, spectrum morphology. So it's the way the different sound spectrum move through time. So if I want to create a certain sound, I've got to think really carefully what those component parts are. And I've got to think, how do they move through space? How do they come into the space? And how do they leave the space? And when you're physically pressing play on 4 different tape machines, you can't press play all at the same time because they're big things. You've got to allow a feed in, a kind of lead in time. Then you've got to fade them all in and be aware of the signal that's going on to the main thing where you're, which is recording all these 8 tracks, 4 separate stereo tracks, onto one stereo track. And it's that physical involvement with the sound that I still want to kind of enjoy when I'm working with digital media. So literally you press tape recorder number 1, fade it in, tape recorder number 2, fade it in, and you are listening, and your fingers are sitting on the mixing desk, and you're listening to every kind of spectra of sound, and I really like that. That's not to say that when I went into a studio quite a few years after that, I was just confronted with a computer and a mouse. And I thought, well, okay, what do I do with that? And typically, if I go back to some of my early works, you see all the fades drawn in on the software. So I'm actually doing the digital equivalent of what I'm doing in the physical world. So that shows you that there's still this kind of idea of, okay, well, I could just press play and just throw all these sounds out there, but they have to kind of come into the space somehow, and they have to leave the space somehow. And what happens to you when you're in that space as a composer, as a performer, and as a listener? You're moved. That's no judgment on quality, whether in a good or a bad way. You're moved by the sound that you hear. So hopefully I can kind of create a narrative that makes sense to you. One of the interesting things about digital music is, or even so-called electroacoustic music, and this goes back to the 1950s, this idea of, was it one of Stockhausen's articles, how do you relate to a piece of music that is only created by, or is only perceivable through loudspeakers? So what does that do? There's a kind of disconnect between a very human experience of listening and performing and hearing physical sound pressure in the room, and actually the fact that it's just coming out of these 2 loudspeakers. And this is something that I'm kind of aware of, and I want to try and bring something more, I suppose, not human, but living into that space, and which takes me back to the idea of, okay, it's really nice to have lots and lots of loudspeakers, but I like the idea of thinking, well, what can I do within the stereo space? It doesn't have to be left and right in the way that it does in 60s music. I mean, there's a great charity shop here, by the way, for those of you on the internet, come to Hull. There's a really good charity shop, and they typically play a lot of 60s and 70s music, so if you're on one corner of the shop, you hear the bass and drums. You go to the other side, you can't hear the bass and drums, but you might hear the sax or a little bit of guitar. I think that's great, but it doesn't really translate over wide spaces, or it does if you use it specifically in an interesting way. But what I really like is the fact that you've got these speakers and you can put the sound there, you can put it there, you can put it, even through psychoacoustics, you can make it come out of the framework, out of the limits of the loudspeakers, and that's a kind of an interesting parameter. I never dictate to people what I want them to hear. I never say, right, you've got to hear this, otherwise you failed as a listener and I failed as a composer. Although it's probably more on me to fail as a composer, but I didn't communicate accurately. But sounds are very subjective. They're very, very subjective. There's been a lot of work in, for those of you who don't know, or those of you who do know, there's a wonderful English composer called Trevor Wishart who created, I think the seminal book was on sonic art, and he wanted to create a kind of glossary or a lexicon, if you will, of sound typologies, based on the idea of what people would associate with those types of sounds. So for example, if you hear a bird, you normally think of flight. If you hear a bird in a cage, you think of something trapped. All these kinds of things. But there are a lot of people who don't think of flight when they hear birds. You know, it's a very, very physical, it's a very kind of personal relationship. So it's very difficult to build up very, very general typologies of sound that way. So if I'm playing with these sounds, and I'll tell you what these sounds are in a second, I wouldn't expect you to know that. And in fact, is it really that interesting if you do know? And is it interesting as a kind of piece of music? The sounds that you just heard were some stones that I collected on a beach on Gotland. There's a wonderful place called the Visby International Composer Centre, and you can go there for a residency. And if you go up to Faroe, which is the northern island, that's where Ingmar Bergman lived, and you get these beautiful rock formations, which I think it is as much as 600 million years ago. That island was on the equator. So you've got rock formations on the equator that are now up somewhere in the Baltic. And so I took these stones, and there was something beautiful about the quality of them, not just, you know, tactile, the haptic quality of them, but if you rub them together, you get these beautiful kind of almost like chime effects. So I recorded them, slowed them down, again with the digital domain, just stretched them over, I maybe improvised with for a minute, and I would stretch them over 50 minutes. And you think, well, can you really hear the difference? But you do, you get internal shaping. You get internal fluctuations, which are you can achieve them doing them live, but I don't like to do that. I like to think, okay, here are my materials. It's a bit like live action painting in a sense. Here are the materials, I'm going to bring them all together in different colours. So what you heard was different improvisations with different types of stones, and some things that weren't stones at all. Well, I'll leave that to you to decide which they were. Again, I'm not sure if that kind of leads your listening. It doesn't have to, but also we have to be careful of how we name things and the materials that we use. And I wanted to just give you a quick example of something that I've composed years ago. I had the fortune to go to Japan, and staying with a family there, you get to see a very, very different side of things. And unfortunately, when I was there was a family funeral. And I was given permission by the family to record the prayer that the priest gave for the family, and I turned it into kind of homage for him and the family. I won't play the prayer now because I believe in actually the sanctity of the sound that you have. It has to be specific. It has to be kind of honoured in that sense. And that goes for all sounds, especially ones where there's the danger of cultural appropriation and kind of fascination and kind of cultural tourism that I'm not really keen on, but that also kind of draws on, or kind of borders on the idea of ethics, the ethics of the sounds you create when you go to different cultures, or the ethics of the sounds you find interesting or you want to record. I have to ask, why am I recording it? You know, the fact is, in England you don't get cicadas going crazy in August saying, me, you know, just shouting, live underground for how many years and just come out for a couple of weeks and say, you know, you don't get that. So actually it's an interesting natural phenomenon. Other things, you know, Japanese television or the announcements you get in public spaces, I have to ask, why do I find that interesting? I find languages interesting, but is that enough for me to record them and use them in a respectful way? But one of the things I wanted to do was, I don't know where I'm talking far too much, but I will shut up in a second, is that I thought, well, the travels around Japan were punctuated by the Shinkansen train, the bullet train. And I thought, well, this is great. I have all these sounds, and I'll take the bullet train, we'll go to another scenario in the piece, and we'll go to another scenario. So there I was standing, naive tourist that I am, on a platform with my microphone, and the Shinkansen comes in, and they don't make a sound. So of course everyone's looking at me, thinking, you know, another example. Actually, it's quite funny. Actually, I have to tell it because I'm just so embarrassed about it. I was just recording whatever I could, walking around shops, and I went into an audio technical shop, and I came out of the lift with my microphone, listening to all the announcements, and then I suddenly saw this array of hundreds of microphones I'd never seen before, and I stood there just open mouthed, and of course someone in the shop just sees me with a microphone recording microphones, just thinking, what's going on? So you know, it's a bit like a kind of camera lens. You can really kind of disconcert people, but if you come at someone with a microphone, they've got no idea what it is you're recording. With the lens, it's really obvious. You're focusing. But if you walk around the street with a microphone, people give you quite an interesting birth. So I wanted to create the sound of the Shinkansen. And this is what I came up with. I'll just play the opening piece. Nothing more than that. These are kind of the opening sounds, just to get you to listen. They don't really have, they have a structural importance, but not a narrative importance, if you see what I mean. So what you hear there is, and I just wanted to leave it to the announcement bells come in, because that is a kind of structural function. You have this long introduction, and you just say bam, 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 and it's quite obvious you're in a different space. So for me, I thought very much about, I mean, there is a kind of physical correlation there to film editing or the introduction to theatre or anything like that. You have this kind of introduction, the overture, and then the curtain goes up. And that's very much what I wanted to do here. And there is a very kind of direct idea there. But what you're hearing there is a train in there, but it's a local rubbishy train going over a crossing. but it's not the Shinkansen. So I don't want to insult the Japanese train industry by saying, well, actually, the Shinkansen sound like that. But I wanted to get this idea of motion going across really, really rapidly, and that is what train recording. But all the gliding sounds I took from voices of, I don't know if you're familiar with Japanese no theatre, with this very constrained vocal, ho, oh, these kind of, glissandi, melisma, and then wood blocks, and then maybe a flute. And I took this one solo and I kind of extended it again to about 10 minutes of sound. So I took this oh, and extended that for 10 minutes of sound, and then I transposed it from as low as I could go in the digital domain, as high as I could over 10 minutes. So you hear these oh, that's where you get this rising pitch. You also get the rising of the wood block as well, and then the flute at the top. So I wanted to kind of frame it spectrally. Otherwise, you could just go anywhere. But you've got this kind of thing, this, I can't remember who talked about the trilling wire. There's something about this, electric wire just trilling, and there's a signal coming, but you don't know where it is. And that's kind of the beginning of the piece as well. There's something coming, and the electricity is in the end. It is an electric phenomenon. So I wanted at least to give this idea of upper pitch. There's a ceiling to where we can go with this, and that actually helps you frame the sound, because if it can go endlessly upwards, then in a way the sound would lose its focus. And I wanted something that was very constrained, very, very vocal, and the sheer process, I think, of smoothing this sound out. I mean, even I'm gritting my teeth as I talk about it, smoothing it out over 10 minutes. The whole guttural thing is a very controlled physical experience. Something that I was able to do also, in the digital domain. There are composers who have done early pieces like that, like Luc Ferrari, who spent hours and hours fading in and out of sound sources over 23, 24 minutes. He did an amazing piece called Presque Leveillant, which was recordings of a little kind of bay on holiday, and you really can't hear the fades. They're exquisite, and they're all done analog. But here I was able to time it, and the other thing with the digital domain is that you can always go backwards. You can always Control Z or something like that. But it actually means that there are so many possibilities. You can drive yourself crazy. So at some point you have to commit to saying, well, this is where this sound comes in, and I'm going to leave it like that. So that's just an example of one way of working with sounds. Another way of working with sounds, I should say. So without further ado, I would like to come to what's the final improvisation. And this is no. I'll tell you afterwards. It's the only way I can build suspense in this. you very much. Just a quick word about the ending. That was completely unexpected. So you just have the form that's given in the evening. The person who helped me with these sounds, in fact, I credit that is Andy Dakin here, sitting here. We have the joy of recording his sculptures when they were still in the library in Hull, in the exhibition space. And yeah, so just went around recording all the different exhibits with this specific idea of nothing that the object wouldn't make without kind of on their own accord, with no external kind of factors influencing, just kind of playing around with their internal sound. So I just wanted to kind of end with that piece to show you a way of working with raw sounds and to see if there's anything that you can obviously play with the different characters of sounds, and if there's something squeaky, does it become funny, is it interesting, what happens when you just make someone focus on that, where is the kind of physical nature of the sound itself? Are you aware of someone hitting things, or is it just kind of objects kind of moving in their own way without any kind of external intervention? And to start off with, and again, I'm quite happy to share as much of this as you would be interested in. I have this wonderful thing here, a Nord micromodular that I've programmed completely chaotically. So I never really know what's going to happen with it. You can program parameters that move in completely contrary directions as widely as you want, within a minimal framework as you want, and I've got them all interacting with each other. So I literally, in the 20 years I've had this, it always sounds slightly different, and I kind of like that, because you just think, okay, I've got to try and catch something in, but I get the feeling it's working against me. So I was trying to combine it with some kind of very, very acoustic sounds. And I wanted to kind of move into a different realm of sounds where I was just kind of aware of time. And the sounds that I wanted to move into is something that actually Sarah mentioned at the beginning. I started to work on a piece that was commissioned by the CIMAS in Mexico, the Center for Audiovisual Arts in Morelia, Mexico. And the idea was about climate change. And I know it's a topic that we hear an awful lot about, and there's an awful lot of artists working with it. But I kind of thought, well, what could I do that would be different in that way? What could I do that would be kind of responsible to the people being affected by it, and also making the, I suppose, ethical decision not to travel to Mexico to present a piece that's 20 minutes long and to give a talk that's half an hour long about climate change. So I kind of pulled that back in and thought, okay, I'm going to make it a very local piece, and I've decided to call it Voices from Hull. And I'm collecting stories of people's experiences of climate change, even the weather, and I want to do a lot of kind of in-depth transformations of their voice to form the narrative of the piece itself. Obviously the integrity of people's voices and their stories remain intact, but they also become a kind of background. That the climate change, in any city, is happening with people as the background and also people as the foreground, and also as intermediaries. So if anyone's interested in that, please do let me know, and you can send me a voice recording, or we can meet up and record. Your voice can be as explicit, as clear to hear as you'd like, or not. It can be kind of part of the background texture. But anyway, I think I've done enough talking, far too much talking, unfortunately I do, and I've done perhaps, hopefully, enough playing. But if there are any questions, please do ask. I'm going to be staying around for a while, or you're very welcome to ask them now, or you can get a drink, or whatever Sarah and Tom think is the best thing. And firstly, thank you very, very much for coming and braving the weather. It's really lovely to see some new faces and some familiar faces as well. And thank you so much to Tom and Sarah for just being wonderfully open and just saying, come here, do your thing. And it's a really great space for that. So thank you so much for your attention. For coming. Thank you.